Usually, sessions of the Indiana General Assembly provide answers. The one that just ended, however, also created a bunch of questions. Questions concerning everyday affordability, political polarization, and the power dynamic among federal, state, and local governments. Now, some of these questions won't be answered for years, even decades, but that doesn't mean we can't start asking them. Hi, I'm John Schwannis, and that's precisely what we're doing on this week's show as we take a closer look at the 2026 session and its legacy with some of the state's most respected journalists. It's Indiana Lawmakers, from the Statehouse to your house.
Indiana Lawmakers is produced by WFYI in association with Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations, with additional support provided by Par Ritchie.
Joining me to talk about the just concluded session and how it will affect Hoosiers are four people who followed most every twist and turn. Caroline Beck, government reporter for WFYI Public Media. Kayla Dwyer, Statehouse reporter for the Indianapolis Star. Arika Herron, Indianapolis reporter for Axios Media. And my longtime public broadcasting colleague, Niki Kelly, editor-in-chief of Indiana Capital Chronicle. Thanks all for being here. Hope you've got a little rest post-session. You know, you all make a living asking questions, and you do it well. So I'm curious, now that the session is over and the dust is settling, what big question do you have about the session we just lived through? I'll start with you, and we'll go right down the line, Caroline.
Yeah. Well, for me, I mean, my wheelhouse has really been education policy for a long time. So,
which always tends to find its way into discussions at the legislature.
Very much. And you know, this session we saw some pretty big legislation coming around that's going to affect the IPS district. You know, creating this whole new board that's going to very much drastically change how we govern schools in Indianapolis for IPS and charter schools. There's still some nitty-gritty details that need to be worked out with all of that. You know, who's going to even be on this board. So all of those things are going to be coming down the line. There's also been some questions too around higher education as well. We saw some moves happen that they want to eliminate low-earning degrees in Indiana now. Last year we saw them try to eliminate the ones with low enrollment degrees. So now we're going, another step further in eliminating these degrees that the state really sees as, just not helpful to students in Indiana. So it'll be interesting to see what the impact to that will be, and also just what's that going to do to the higher education landscape and how Hoosier kids feel about attending college in Indiana if they see all these actions happening to them. So I'm keeping an eye on that and seeing what will happen to that for sure. Yeah.
Arika.
I think my big question is just what actually comes of any of this. So many of the proposals, I think they you talked about at the start of session, really changed a lot. It got watered down, got pushed back, got delayed. So will we see any of these actually come to fruition and make a difference for Hoosiers, especially when you talk about things like affordability?
Let's keep going.
I think the biggest question for me is we're still waiting to see the impact of, and before we forget, the session started with the redistricting. So I'm still waiting to see the full impact of that redistricting vote and how it plays out in upcoming, especially Senate Republican primaries. So that one I think will need a little time to tell.
And for those who might have missed it, might have been snowbirds in the South, of course, the president and the governor had pushed for a mid-decade redistricting plan, perhaps to give Republicans an advantage in the midterms on the congressional races. And Republicans, 21 out of the 40 in the chamber said no. But that will have some, and there are some who say that the governor's profile during the session might have been a little lower, perhaps because of what the defeat he was handed early on.
And many of those senators who are seeking re-election have primaries for the first time, and we're going to see a lot of probably national money flow in, so that's what I'll be watching, and it all goes back to the start of the session.
And Donald Trump had a chat with some of those folks recently. We'll see how much support and how much money he pumps into those races. Kayla.
Yeah, and speaking of redistricting, I mean, that caused the rest of session to be shortened, right? And deadlines were pushed up and everything was rushed through. So that relates to my big question. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I heard more often this session instances where lawmakers couldn't explain parts of their bills or couldn't answer questions about parts of their bills, just basically admitting they don't know what their bills do. Mm-hmm. also admitting like, oh, this might result in a lawsuit, especially with the social media bill. And what companies does that impact? And so my big question is like, what legal trouble is the state going to field from various bills? Another example that comes to mind is the SB1, the Medicaid bill, conforming us with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and Medicaid work requirements. Advocates were pointing out there's a number of instances where we seem to conflict with what federal law wants us to do. So how is that going to get worked out, either via waiver or litigation or what? So I think seeing the consequences of how rushed this was will be really interesting.
Do you think that the reason that lawmakers can't always explain everything in the bill as they're drafted is because there's more boilerplate language that's cut and paste coming from other states, other organizations? It's interesting, when you travel throughout the country and you pick up the paper, turn on the news, you say, oh, I just saw that issue in Indianapolis, or vice versa. And maybe that's a reflection of the growing influence that national politics, we saw any number of issues, redistricting, of course, being a biggie, but also National Guard, policing powers, and the call up, when the governor can call up and how he can deploy or she can deploy these folks. We saw it with everything from an issue I didn't even know we had, which is ranked choice voting, but I guess we're going to be ahead of the game there. CDL driver's licenses, truckers being able have to speak English. A lot of these bills did seem to be grow up elsewhere. Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, well, especially with the National Guard bill that you mentioned, when they were discussing that in committee, when we were hearing explanations from the supporters of that bill, they were pointing to the Boston Marathon massacre and the reflection on that about how the National Guard was reacting to that. And that was, in 2013. So a lot of people were like, so why are we talking about this now if it was what we found in 2013? And so then that, caused a lot of the Democrats to point out, well, look at the instances in Minneapolis when we're seeing, troops on the streets policing our own citizens. That's obviously going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. So is this really a good policy in place for Indiana to potentially, have that effect on Hoosier citizens here? So I know that caused a lot of concern, and there just didn't seem like a real explanation of why this is needed now.
Similar bill with the the federal administration's push for enhanced legislation on immigration, which now says that if you're a post-secondary institution, you essentially have to police students more closely, or or if you're a local law enforcement official, you have if ICE has a detention order, you better get out there and you better house those individuals. Is that going to come back to bite? I should say this bill also has some teeth in that it gives the Attorney General, the state Attorney General, more authority to police the new police folks, if you want to call universities the new police. Where does this lead, do you think? Does this have lasting repercussions?
I think so. I think it's a combination of all of these immigration bills. We're going to see some definite lasting, repercussions, especially when you talk about the higher ed landscape, because it's really, we've already seen it curb international student enrollment by quite a bit over the last year. So if we're continuing to push these sorts of policies that either make it harder for international students to come to our schools in our state, or just make them more afraid of what the outcome might be for them, I think we'll see that continue to decline. We actually published a story today about whether or not this is going to force public institutions to raise their tuition, because they're not being able to rely on the international and out-of-state tuition, that they would have gotten from these students otherwise. And will they have to, raise tuition for in-state students now to make up the difference? So I think we definitely will see lasting impacts.
And if those, if we tried to, I sat down the other day and tried to group these things into broad categories, because 100 plus bills, and they're all over the board. This was quite a disparate collection. But certainly there are those that I mentioned reflected national politics, and clearly were influenced by the White House and others, and what's happening in other states. Another one, the buzzword this session, affordability. If I heard affordability once, I heard it 1,000 times. It was the motivation, ostensibly, for all the priority bills coming out, I guess, of both supermajority caucuses, certainly the House bills, as they sought to combat housing costs, as they sought to combat rising utility bills, governmental costs. Their answer was a consolidation, perhaps, of governmental units and commissions and boards that aren't necessarily needed. Will Hoosiers feel any benefit financially from this session, do you think, Niki?
I mean, there's certainly no guarantee. I mean, on one hand, you got to give lawmakers, I guess, credit for recognizing that Hoosiers are struggling and that the economy, whether it be your electric bill, your gas bill, your rent, is problematic and wanting to try to do something. I do think they started out with sort of, especially in the housing bill, with sort of going much more aggressive and slowly had to pull that back. The one thing the housing
Locals were saying, hey,
Yeah.
we're tying our hands.
Yeah.
We have no more zoning control if this goes
And
through
now
as
most
is.
of the locals can opt out of those things. But let's say they don't opt out. There was still nothing in that bill that would require or make sure that developers and builders pass those savings on. Like, just because it's cheaper for them to build the house, are they still going to sell the house for the same amount of money? And that to me is kind of a big miss.
And utilities was another one, as I mentioned, and the desire was to make sure we all had stable bills, or if not lower bills. And there are a lot of things going on with the Utility Regulatory Commission, a new lineup and hearings that are taking place. But one of the bills would have specifically changed the rate-making process and have more performance-based. It's like, how good is your service when you come to us and ask for more money, dear electric company? We saw some of the advocates say, this bill is great if you're low income, it'll keep your electricity from being shut off, but if you're the average Hoosier, you're not going to see it. Again, I guess a version of the same question. Is there anything tangible, significant that came out of this that Hoosier consumers will actually feel?
It does feel like the low-hanging fruit that can affect mostly low-income Hoosiers, which is great, but even when you talk about budget billing, you're still going to have to reconcile those bills later on in the year. So in the whole year, you're still.
We're not allowed to call it budget billing.
Oh, we're not?
Yeah. In the bill.
Is that that's written in, I think,
It
section,
is,
provision,
yeah.
subsection 5?
My
yeah.
bad. What is it called? What is the?
I don't want to be you
correct
when you
term?
open your bill next
Consistent
month.
billing,
No.
maybe?
Okay. Well, either way, you still will have to pay. You'll have to pay up by the end of the year, right? So it helps you.
The reconciliation. I think you can still call it the reconciliation month
Okay.
or payment. So you're off the hook.
But performance-based rate making, I mean, I think it's one of those things that sounds good and probably will result in fewer. Like right now, they can go request new rates anytime they want, right? So this limits them to every 3 years and says like you have to meet certain benchmarks. So that probably will result in fewer shifts for the consumer. But of course, what will those shifts be? Will they overcompensate by making the shifts themselves larger since they have to do it less often? That's to be seen. On the other hand, Governor Braun is appointing more consumer advocate types to the IURC, so maybe they will come down harder on these utilities.
And they've already announced hearings that are essentially, I say it's a shot across the bow to any utility that wasn't paying attention and didn't realize that there will be new redoubled attention to every rate increase.
And it's about time because Republicans have controlled this government either through the legislature or the governor for decades now, and they had let that pendulum swing too far in the favor of the utilities. So now the only question is how much further is it going to swing back?
It's going to be interesting to see. And as I go through this exercise of trying to categorize, another one would be protection of vulnerable communities or populations. We saw it with the constitutional amendment, which voters will get to decide on with bail reform. Currently, unless you're charged with treason or murder, you can get out on bail. It's in the state constitution. If voters now, based on what came out of the legislature this session and in a prior session, they'll have a chance to say, let's make sure that we keep dangerous people behind bars. One of you mentioned earlier the cell phone ban, expanding that in schools, protect our kids, or enhanced protections surrounding social media, particularly among users under 16. I heard debates, on will Snapchat apply or not, that I certainly my parents, forget my parents' generation, that I never would have thought I would have heard that came up as Indiana struggles. Is there much meat there in those bills?
Yeah. I think definitely the one that's going to probably be seen the most impact for parents and students immediately is that cell phone ban bill in schools, which is, essentially the bell-to-bell ban, where kids will not be able to access, or they're supposed to not to be able to access their phones during the school day.
Unless they have they can use it for
unless they have like
remediation
a health
program.
Yes, health or other, exception. And so that, I think, could, actually do a lot of good for the state and for a lot of schools and kids' attention, certainly. But then, there is the big question of, will the social media ban, which is supposed to, curtail what those who are under 16 can actually see on social media every day, it's going to be a big question of if that's going to face legal problems. It probably will, because pretty much every other state that's tried to do this is facing legal battles with that. So that one is a little, uncertain if there's real meat there on the bone. But it is certainly, telling that the lawmakers really want to crack down on technology use for kids, what kids are subjected to every day when it comes to technology. So, yeah.
And that's one of those classic cases of the devil is in the details, because it's how do you define the potential boogeyman that is dangerous social media? It's $1 billion revenue. It exempts those that are direct messaging, perhaps, and in a way that makes my I'm this close to getting my MySpace account, and thank goodness I don't have to worry about sifting through that legislation.
We don't know whether Snapchat will.
We don't know.
That was one of the
Snapchat.
questions actually on the floor that the bill author didn't know.
And there is this, you pointed out earlier, this willingness to wade into, a potential quagmire of litigation, which in the past I heard lawmakers, when they're debating things, often say, let's wait until we see what the courts say on this. Let's wait for the Supreme Court. We don't want to waste our effort. Now, there seems much greater capacity or propensity to tackle some of these issues. Is there some fundamental change in the air here, or is it just a desire that, a lot of these were ripped from the headlines bills. We had this tragic murder of Fisher's, 17-year-old Fisher's resident, spurred a lot of this. Her parents were very active, and that seemed to really propel legislation that might not have crossed the finish line this session. Is that why we're seeing sort of litigation be damned? Let's just do something?
I think that's a little bit of it. I don't think the social media language would have gone forward. They looked like they were ready to kill that kind of in the first half of session until, what happened, the tragedy with Haley Busby really, brought that back. But I think it's always, the last few years at least, it's always been the case that, they're going to shy away from legislation that might bring, legal challenges, unless it's for the right issue. We've other, bills get challenged every year in the courts, and we've seen them, over the last few years, really say, like, bring it on, basically, for if it's an issue that's important enough to them, if it, is one of their kind of hallmark issues, and they're willing to just go forward with it. So I don't know that that is particularly new this year.
No sea change here as far as you can tell?
I mean, I see a sea change from when I first started reporting, here at the legislature in the late 1990s versus now. I mean, back then, all anyone had to say was the word lawsuit, and, they would kind of back away. But also, I do think the lawmakers have become sort of desensitized to it, right? Like, they get sued, like, constantly over every bill now. So now the ACLU saying, we'll take you to court doesn't scare them anymore.
Yeah, and there does seem to be, on a lot of these issues, a willingness, we'll take a step now. This isn't, this recognition, it's not perfect, it's not a done deal. We saw some bills where the effective date was pushed back. So with some of the consolidations or eliminations of boards and commissions, so they basically saying, we'll go ahead and pass this, we'll get it signed, but it's all up for debate again next session. And we saw several bills like that. Again, just this hedging of bets seems to be in vogue right now.
Yeah, and I think it's also a chance to then also just send a message about an issue. Like, see, we still do care about government efficiency, and we're doing it. We're just pushing it off a little bit. So once you go down the path of some of these bills, you don't want to then be called out for doing absolutely nothing, even though it's actually kind of doing nothing.
But at least you can go and campaign, as a lot of these folks are
it's
now
an
engaged
election
in
year.
campaigns,
Thank you.
either
Yes.
primaries or the November general, saying we dealt with affordability, we dealt
Yes.
with your utility bills, we dealt with your housing
We cut
costs.
down on the bureaucracy. We're saving you money. Yeah, all these things. Yeah.
In terms of the consolidations, one thing that surprised me, frankly, I didn't see going into it, in part because it's been a front burner issue by some people since 2007 when the so-called Kernan-Shepard report came out. about the consolidation or elimination of certain aspects of township government. In fact, if you want to go back to Governor Paul McNutt in 1936, I think he was advocating much the same. So it's sort of just always bumped along. This session, it wasn't anybody's priority, and yet we might have legislation that eliminates, as many as 300 of the 1,000 or so townships.
Yes, yeah, they did do actual, some more work on that effort, and they did come to some, middle ground agreement where, before they were just wanting to look at townships based off of their size or their location, and now there's actual language put into the final bill that, says actually performance-wise, like how are they actually doing as township people and governing, where they live. So I think that is an interesting approach that they, again, seem to be going to a more middle ground, maybe more watered down language.
There won't be as many eliminated perhaps as there would have been otherwise.
Yeah, so that will be interesting to see.
And this is another one, again, it's going to save perhaps some money somewhere, but you look at local government, whether it's township, whether it's county, whether it's city, they're still reeling from the reforms of last session, the property tax reform, where essentially the General Assembly said, all right, we're going to cut it, and we're giving you, dear locals, the authority to recover those costs, meaning that the taxpayer might end up with the same out-of-pocket burden in the end. We haven't seen a whole lot of that yet, but it's all going to come to a head, I guess, in this upcoming budget session, would you think?
Yeah, I think,
because it's not tenable the way it is. Is that, that's the sense I have.
We've heard that from a lot of locals, and we heard, people worried about that last year, and then we did see some folks coming, to various, to testify in various bills this year, talking about the impact of that already and the cuts that we've seen. But yeah, you haven't had, again, it's an election year for a lot of folks. You haven't seen a lot of locals want to take up the issue of actually increasing taxes. That's never popular. That's why the legislature
don't see people racing to come issue that agenda.
But it's going to come to a point where it's like you also have to provide services. So trying to navigate, those two things is getting tough for locals.
Well, it was actually compounded this session, was it not? Because of the...
Well, they did tweak some things from that bill. You might have missed it because it was in a massive 400-page Department of Local Government Finance bill. So, you have to... But they did move out some dates on some of the changes.
More of the familiar move out the date.
Yeah, that's where people were showing up, and local officials were showing up saying, we can't survive this.
So but you have other bills where it might hurt them more, like the alignment of state law, tax law with the big, beautiful bill in terms of overtime, in terms of these type, with that, by bringing that in alignment, wasn't there potential for some locals to be hit a little bit more?
That's mostly a big state hit.
Okay.
I'm sure there's a small local hit.
Locals can breathe a little easier on that one. And as we talk about dates being moved out and sort of the factors we can't determine, two classic examples are that the General Assembly cleared the way for a casino in Northeast Indiana. They added citizen referenda in the 3 counties that apparently will vie for this. But no guarantee that it happens. I assume the appetite is there for another casino. But again, no certainty. Surprised with anything on the gaming front. They said no to online gaming for casinos, said no to online gaming for the Hoosier Lottery. These are other things that had been in the hopper, but casinos or an expansion seems to have had enough support to carry the day.
I guess you don't want to do too much gaming in one session, right? Based on some troubles we've had in the past. But it's not terribly surprising that this happened this session, just because the State Gaming Commission did study this, and as prompted by lawmakers last session, they came up with Indianapolis and Fort Wayne as most lucrative spots for a new casino. I guess I was a little surprised Indianapolis wasn't even in the running, really. That was booted out pretty quickly.
And that's ostensibly because of the horse racing industry. The tracks in Anderson and Shelbyville said that they would have been hurt more, for instance, than... And if, I guess in Northeast Indiana, you're drawing into the Michigan and Ohio consumers opposed to cannibalizing Indiana. That's the thinking, I suppose?
Yeah, and also, there might also be a little bit of Indianapolis has enough. But at any rate, so I think the issue about the local referendum stuff, though, that was kind of surprising. That
was very much last minute, yeah.
I was shocked because I've covered gaming in this, and every single gaming expansion has required a referendum. And this went through the whole process, and every time anyone asked, why isn't there a referendum in this, it was basically like, well, that'll slow us down, and we might have a Native American tribe start one before we can. Like it became this like competition thing. And then thankfully, I'll give Governor Brown credit on this. You know, the last couple of days of session, he let it known that he would veto that bill if it didn't have a referendum. There was no reason to treat Northeast Indiana different than every other county in this state that has gaming and let their citizens have a say, which I think was better for public policy.
You got to wonder what kind of pressure was going on behind the scenes to not have a local referendum.
Oh, I would imagine when you look at gaming, I always say that's the balloon. You press it here, it has to pop out somewhere else because it's not a zero-sum game. I mean, if you help brick and mortar casinos, then are you hurting those who derive most of their revenue online? Or the horse industry at bay because of changes on lot of money at stake there. Any surprises on that front as far as I
mean, I really don't think I could add much to what else they've just said, but yeah, the fact about Indianapolis being left out, I think, was a big, question mark for a lot of folks that we're paying attention to.
But they pay attention to Indianapolis in other ways, like taking over,
ways.
potentially taking over law enforcement in the
finally
downtown.
something for the rest of
Yeah,
us,
exactly.
and Indianapolis is complaining.
Like, we've got enough sports, don't worry.
Well, let's give another wild card then that by definition is sort of we'll pass it and maybe they'll build it and they'll come, or maybe they won't. And that's the Bears.
The Bears.
Now the Chicago Bears would be the Hammond the Bears, I guess. So we have a stadium commission set up now in Northwest Indiana. Not surprisingly, there's excitement. There's also concern that we don't want to put this on the backs of taxpayers. I mean, a lot of the familiar arguments. Is this more than a bargaining chip for the Bears to get what they want in Illinois, do you think?
It's so hard to say. I mean, everyone seems to think so. I mean, it's certainly, this has been a conversation that's been happening for decades, and this is the furthest it's ever gotten. So, the lawmakers seem to think that the Bears are very serious. They think that they're being, honest brokers in this negotiation. Remains to be seen. I mean, Illinois could still make a better offer that could tempt them away. So I don't know. I mean, it does feel more real than it has in the past. So we'll just have to see. But this whole idea of the two stadiums that they're looking at, Hammond is closer to downtown Chicago than the suburban one they're looking at. A lot of teams don't play in the city, that their team name is derived from, or even the same state. So I think that, moving across state lines is not necessarily the big issue that everyone is trying to make it out to be, people who want to see it.
And if we don't get that, we could go after the Bengals. I mean, if Ohio County loses the Rising Sun Casino, we'll just go after the Bengals. We'll go after everybody.
Baseball teams, they don't need two. We could get one.
Oh, we're going to stir the pot here. We're going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
We could talk for hours, but thankfully you've been here to share some wonderful insights and help us all decipher what did and didn't happen over the past few months here at the Statehouse. I thank you for that. Again, my guests have been Caroline Beck of WFYI Public Media, Kayla Dwyer of the Indianapolis Star, Arika Herron of Axios Indianapolis, and Niki Kelly of Indiana Capital Chronicle. It's been said that elections have consequences. True enough, but legislative actions can also have consequences for elections. We'll look at upcoming races on the next Indiana Lawmakers. Well, that's it for this week. I'm John Schwannis. On behalf of everyone involved in the program, I thank you for joining us. Until next week, take care.
Indiana Lawmakers is produced by WFYI in association with Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations, with additional support provided by Par Ritchie.